think we should remember that these peace talks were initiated by the American President Donald Trump, and there were no indications prior to Trump coming back to power in January 2025 that peace talks were even on the table. So Trump had insisted that these talks take place, that he could be the mediator, and his original claim was that he could end the war in one day, which he's obviously failed to do. I think Trump himself is beginning to realize that the Russian demands are simply too extreme and that Russia is not really adhering to the idea of ceasefire or stopping heavy weapons attacks on Ukrainian cities. Well, they make a big impression. The attacks on particularly on energy installations affect the daily lives of people. And they've been a big factor in this war. I remember Russia knocking out the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine. Ukraine has responded in kind with drones. And I think the feature of it is that there's no real defense against such things. They're completely unpredictable. And for example, Ukraine can launch drones as far away as Siberia, which happened a couple of days ago, and away to the north in the city of Murmansk. Russia can hit any Ukrainian city at the same time. So this has become a war that really is not supposed to be about civilians. It's supposed to be, according to Putin, a special military operation, but it's the civilians that always suffer. The fact is there are different schools of thought, I think, in the Russian leadership. Some are more militaristic than others, such as Medvedev, for example. But generally, everybody in Russia seems to believe that they have some advantages in this war, that they're gradually gaining territory, and that Ukraine, in order to get any kind of negotiation, must come to the table and must be willing to give up territories. Ukraine, for its part, could argue that these territories, for the most part, apart from Crimea and Luhansk, are not really controlled by Russia. For example, Kherson region in the south of Ukraine, the main city is still in Ukrainian hands. In Zaporizhia, the same thing applies to the major city there. And even in Donetsk, where most of the territory is held by Russia, they still haven't conquered all of it, even after 3 years of fighting, when they were already in a very strong position when the war broke out in February 2022. So I think, Russia is not in quite such strong a position as it maintains. And the fact that it's taken this long, 3 years, for one of the world's largest military powers, and possibly, the world's largest nuclear weapons power, to move so slowly, suggests to me that this is not a winnable war anytime soon, and that if it goes on, it will go on for a very long time. And I think peace talks on these grounds are not going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians. They're not going to sit down and give up territories en masse in such a fashion, unless every ally of Ukraine suddenly turns around and abandons them. That would be the only way that they would give up these territories. I think we should remember that these peace talks were initiated by the American President Donald Trump, and there were no indications prior to Trump coming back to power in January 2025 that peace talks were even on the table. So Trump had insisted that these talks take place, that he could be the mediator, and his original claim was that he could end the war in one day, which he's obviously failed to do. And I think Trump himself is beginning to realize that the Russian demands are simply too extreme, and that Russia is not really adhering to the idea of ceasefire or stopping heavy weapons attacks on Ukrainian cities while these talks are in progress. I mean, they have some talks, and then a Ukrainian city will be bombed the very next day, sometimes even on the same day that the talks are taking place. So it doesn't make sense. It's not really the way peace talks are negotiated. And if you look back to 2013-14, when there was, if you like, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine with Crimea and the Donbass, when the sides came to the table there, it was with French and German mediation. All heavy weapons were removed from the fighting zone, and the attacks stopped on both sides. And Ukraine was in a very weak position then, a weaker position than it's in now. But at that time, Russia still stopped these kind of bombing and heavy fighting. This time, it doesn't seem prepared to stop. And I think this reflects Vladimir Putin's own strategy of not giving away on anything and holding out for the best option, which for Russia is to control these regions of Ukraine, sign some treaty, and then eventually try to take more of Ukraine and bring down the government in Kiev, because I see that as the long-term Russian strategy to change the government in Ukraine and occupy as much of it as possible. It's a difficult question. The NATO issue maybe could be looked at separately from the other two, because I think right now Ukraine would not be accepted into NATO. I mean, it has to be a unanimous decision, and NATO members are saying in some cases that they would never allow Ukraine. It was actually an election platform of the recently elected Polish president, Mr. DawnNews, yesterday, that Ukraine should not be allowed into NATO. So I think that's a difficult one. I think most Ukrainians today would like to join NATO, but they're not really in a position to do that. So that one might be some kind of negotiated policy with the Russians. The question of the Russian language shouldn't really be an issue, in my opinion, because many parts of Ukraine were Russian speaking when this war began. And in my view, it's a mistake on the Ukrainian government's part to crack down on the language issue, because for many years it was not an issue. There were never any real disputes over language in Ukraine prior to, say, 2014. In fact, you didn't even know in some regions whether the person speaking Russian was an ethnic Ukrainian or ethnic Russian. And it didn't really matter. So I don't think that should be such a big issue. But the other issues on new elections, for example, there's nothing to do with Russia. And the fact is that Ukraine cannot call an election while it is under military law, military curfew. The conditions don't allow for an election to take place. So I don't see any problem with Zelensky remaining in power for that reason. If military law is lifted, then Ukraine should immediately hold a general election. But until that happens, and until it's in a situation where it's possible for Ukraine to do that, then I don't see a problem with this government remaining in power. It really reflects on Putin's priorities that on days like Victory Day, May the 9th, or other national days when, particularly in May, I mean, May was the big month for Russian commemorative days and holidays, the fighting should stop on those occasions, for 3 days or whatever it is. This really, to me, is irrelevant, that if you're going to have a ceasefire, you're going to have negotiations, you should stop for a month, at least a month, to give both sides time to recover, to collect their dead from the war zones, to exchange prisoners, or whatever they want to do. It cannot be sort of a transient 2 or 3 day period, which really doesn't give either side time to do anything really cogent. That's basically my opinion of that it's got to be a long-term issue. They've got to stop fighting for at least a month for it to have any impact on this war. I've actually argued for a long time that Turkey is a very good choice to be a mediator in this war, because Turkey is both a member of NATO, but it's also led by Erdogan, who's maintained very close ties with the Russian government, so he can actually see both sides. I also thought, that China was another possibility at one time, that the Chinese put forward this peace plan, but nothing seemed to come of that. And now China seems to be leaning more towards the Russian side, whereas Turkey has remained completely neutral. And I think there are other countries that have remained neutral in this war that could possibly play a role in a long-term strategy of peace, including, in fact, your own country, also places like Brazil, maybe countries of the Southeast Asia region as well. It cannot really be negotiated by leading NATO members, for example, or close allies of Russia, such as North Korea. I think it has to be neutral countries. And Turkey, with its location, its very central Black Sea location, seems to me ideal. And I think Turkey could play a role in the future in this regard as the mediator in this war. Having said that, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. That's my personal opinion. I think probably there has to be some kind of means of bringing Russia to the table, because I think it's quite clear right now that Ukraine is interested in a ceasefire. It's losing too many troops. It's finding it very difficult to conscript people to join the Ukrainian army. I mean, day after day on social media, you see these videos of people being forcibly conscripted into bands as it goes around the streets of different cities. It's not a good sign. And it's increasingly becoming a concern for the population of Ukraine that this war is not going anywhere. But on the Russian side, you don't see this so much among the population. Putin remains very popular. The war is sometimes even like a footnote in the daily news. It doesn't always make the front pages. As far as they can see, Russia is doing quite well in this war, and the Western powers seem to be a little divided on how they should respond. I think they have to respond quite strongly. If not through the United States, then the European Union has to be committed in its support for Ukraine for the long term, not only in ending the war, but in providing some aid to build up the economy and reconstruct some of the major towns once the war is over, because Ukraine is very much part of the European community now. And I think in the long term, that's where it belongs. I don't think it necessarily is part of this Russian sphere of influence, as Putin likes to claim. And, one disturbing thing for me is that it's a case really of Russia exerting an imperialist stance against a smaller neighbor. And imperialism is something that we thought had ended back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s at least. And yet Russia is laying claim to territories that it has no right to unless you go back to the period of the Russian Empire. So this is the way Russia is thinking under Vladimir Putin. I think the war was a big mistake for Russia, and I definitely think it's necessary to force Russia to the table by some means, perhaps by supplying Ukraine with suitable weapons. That seems to be one mode of thinking, but there's the other option of applying heavier sanctions, including sanctions on countries that are taking oil and gas from Russia. That would include China and India, which have really made up for the shortfall in European purchases, and allowed Russia to continue this war without any kind of economic breakdown. And I think the sanctions mode for me is a preferable one, simply because of the massive loss of lives that have been incurred so far, and that will continue if more and more weapons are simply sent to Ukraine to, respond to Russian attacks.